It's time for us to start lighting the map and adding post-processing. Now, I'm going to warn you ahead of time that when we're doing the initial lighting, it's probably going to seem like it's slightly off. And the reason for this is that I really am probably going to be tuning most of this through the post-processing rather than the lighting itself. So don't be too scared when you see that happening. Now, the first step is going to be to go and get a light mass importance volume and drop it into the scene. So this light mass importance volume is going to encompass our main area here, okay? So I'm going to set this up and just set it to a reasonable size. 33,000 seems good. And I'm going to set this up to encompass the rest of the map too. Might be a little big, but it's probably alright. Might actually lift that up too because it goes under the map. Seems like it should be fine. Cool. So we've set that importance volume up, which we need for when we're baking lighting. And the next thing I'm going to do is go back to our directional light and I'm going to modify it. Realistically, we actually want stationary in this setup. Now, the current lighting is set to 3.1, but I actually want this to be significantly brighter for its direct light because I really want to have a strong contrast between what's there and then the shadows themselves. Now at the moment these shadows are pure black. They have no environmental lighting kind of bouncing back into them. But don't stress, we'll fix that up in just a moment. Initially though, I'm going to set this up to a value of about 10, potentially go a little bit higher if I wanted to, push up to 11, see how that looks in a little bit. And I'm then going to go and set the sun up to be in a good location. At the moment it's over there, but I'd really like it to kind of be shining down and casting strong shadows over the map. So I'm going to grab it and I'm going to rotate it around. Now let's get it about, I'm going to put it about there. Now one thing that's happening at the moment is when I look around the map, notice that the sun still seems like it's over there. That's because I'm going to delete the skybox. And instead the sun's light is now coming from the atmospheric fog that we have in the map, which has the ability to determine where the directional light is and sort out the sun's projection from there. I don't actually really want a skybox since most of the time we're going to be looking down or at severe angles, so I'm not too fussed. If I wanted to, I could adjust the skybox to compensate for it, but it's really just not necessary in this case. So I'm going to place this around to about here. I really want to be trying to push out those shadows wherever I can though. Now this is going to look a little weird at first, as I mentioned, but I think once we kind of get the skylight in, it'll start coming together. So the final angle that I've got is, it's going to be one of those things I'm going to adjust a bunch of times. Ah, there we go. Actually, that looks quite nice with it kind of popping up over there. I might change the severity of the angle to kind of start creeping in a bit, so it just is hitting the side of the statue. And now how far can I push it that way? Okay, cool. So my values ended up being over here, -10, -50, -156. Use your own values as well though, it doesn't matter too much. So we've got this in place, and the next thing I'm going to do is add a skylight. And when I drop the skylight in, you'll notice that the world looks substantially better. Now the skylight is just adding in that ambient lighting. You'll notice that everywhere that we had shadows, the skylight's now compensating for. I'm going to place this up here so it's a bit easier for me to find. And at the moment the skylight, I'm going to leave it be because any of the values that I touch here, I'm going to want to have compensated for with my post-processing. So default's probably okay. Instead I'm going to go back to my light source and start tweaking this a little bit. Now the light color at the moment is a pure white. I'm actually again happy to leave that for the time being until I adjust the post-process. It's going to be one of those things that's going to go through a little bit of an iteration before I find something right, but for the time being it's okay. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to start looking at the light shafts. Now one of the things that I like to do is make sure that any camera angles that are kind of going to be in these kind of areas or just general hero shots, I want to make sure that they're going to look quite nice with how their light shafts work. So I'm going to enable light shaft occlusion, and I'm also going to enable light shaft bloom. So you'll notice that kicked in immediately. And if I was to see this as my camera passed between them, you can see that the light shafts are being projected there. Now this is really just for those smaller elements if we do any sequencer type of events that are showing off the map to make sure they're all set up. Again, this is one of those things where if the sun was down, you'd have a far more prominent light shaft, but it all depends on the effect that you're really after. So I'm going to leave that where it is. And I've got some basic light shafts set up now, so I'm going to go down and keep setting up some of the features. Now one of the things that's really important for outdoor maps is cascading shadow maps. So I'm going to set these up. Now a cascaded shadow map, you should remember from the ArcViz demo, it's essentially a nice dynamic shadow that's being cast where on top of the existing baked shadows. So I'm going to turn this value up initially to be a distance of, just as a test, I'm going to go 3000, and I'm going to keep the rest defaults and again come back and tweak them after my first lighting bake. So light source and skylight are both pretty much set for just a quick pass. It wouldn't be a bad idea for me to later go back and add some trees, but I didn't want to do that until we'd done a lighting pass so I could figure out where they would look nice. But I think we're okay for the time being. And now I'm going to do a quick build. So again, if you missed it, one of the important steps was making sure that your light source was set to stationary rather than movable, which is what I developed with. So go on and hit build and come back to the presentation when it's all built. So our first build of lighting has now come through, and we can see that it looks substantially different. This first build is looking a lot nicer though, and we can see that the bounce lights all kind of come in. It's not as blue as it first seemed. As I said, when you first add your lights in, it's very easy to kind of start compensating before you've actually seen the final result, and that can be a really damaging thing, so you've got to be careful not to do that. I'm going to go through and add some post-processing to the scene though, and start to kind of develop what I want to be the final look. So to add a post-process volume, I just need to go to here and type in post and drop that in. Now remember there's this button that says unbound that we used earlier, which essentially applies it whether you're in the volume or not. It just applies it to the whole world. So I'm going to set it to unbound. And I'm now going to go through and just start setting up my, my post-process volume. The first thing that I'm going to tinker with on this is going to be under settings, white balance. Now at the moment our white balance is set to 6500, so that is standard white temp. But you'll notice that if we tweak the white balance, we can kind of change the overall lighting in the scene. And this is why I said I didn't really want to touch the lighting color from the light itself. I wanted to kind of tweak it a little bit through the post-process. So initially I'm going to set this to somewhere around the 7,500 mark to kind of get that just slight orange glow kicking in. So 7,800 seems pretty good. A little bit of an orange look to it, which is nice. So that's good. I'm going to start with that. At which point I'm going to go through and I'm going to start setting up the ambient occlusion, because that's the next one that really kind of ties everything together nicely. So I'm going to go to the AO and let's set that up. Now, currently the AO intensity is set to 0.5. I actually want pretty intense AO. You can see the scene between 0 and 1 here. One of the reasons that I really want to crank up the AO is these assets, while they're quite nice, they don't blend together particularly well. And that's largely because they were mobile assets that have been made to be, super efficient. And one of those things means low poly counts and materials that don't allow me to really paint into them and stuff like that. So I personally think it's a good idea to turn up your ambient occlusion intensity so I can kind of start darkening up these gaps and kind of hiding some of what we would see there as an issue. So I've set that up to 1. I'm also going to go to radius, and I'm going to enable radius in world space, which means the AO is calculated as far as world space distance rather than screen space. So this radius that I have, I'm actually going to turn down to about 100, which is starting to work a little bit nicer. You can see it really filling in there. Again, off, on, off, on. And now that we've done that, I'm also going to tweak the power, which is the contrast, and the bias. So the bias, I'm going to lower a bit. So if this was a high bias, you'd see that we have very tight AO that quickly changes the fall off. but if I go a very low bias, it kind of goes from here and blurs out into the asset itself. So in this case, I think a bias, I might even go around 2.5 just to kind of pull it in a bit, but still spread it around those main walls. I really want to make sure that this facade looks quite nice from the AO as well. So that's set up, and that seems okay. The next thing I'm going to change is the global illumination. So this is the indirect lighting color that we can start tweaking, and this allows us to kind of modify these shadows a bit. So if I go to here and I start to set this, you can see that the shadows adopt the color that I'm putting in there. And in this case, I like to go with a bit of a bounce light that seems like it's more from the sun. So I think a slightly orangier color on the bounce lighting is going to look nice. And I can change this to wherever I want it to be. I can crank it up pretty high if I want. In this case, though, I want to keep it, I think, around a value of 1.5 or 2 is going to look quite nice. 1.5 we'll go with for the time being. So we've got that environment now that's kind of tied together. I'm going to go through as well, and remember earlier I disabled auto exposure. So I'm going to go to lit, exposure, and good. We are back at automatic. I just wanted to make sure that that was set. So we're now looking at it as we would be looking at it in the game. And I think for the most part, these post-process settings have actually worked reasonably nicely. It's going to be a good idea for us to approach it again later. I think for the time being, we've got a nice general look that we can really kind of work with, and we can see how we would structure the rest of it. I'm actually going to go ahead and add a little bit more to my detail pass, just some trees and such in the distance. And then we're going to move on to the next presentation, which is going to be actually starting to develop the project itself. So we'll be moving on to gameplay next.